Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you in-depth conversations with the brightest minds in defense, security, and foreign policy. Each week, we delve into the most pressing issues facing our world today. In today's episode, Vincent Rigby discusses the complexity of Canada-India relations in light of recent allegations of Indian involvement in the murder of a Canadian citizen. Rigby focused on the challenges Canada faces in managing its relationship with India, particularly in the context of recent allegations and national security concerns. He also delved into the difficulties of striking a balance between addressing interference tactics and extremism while maintaining diplomatic and economic cooperation. This is the Expert Series. Mr. Rigby, it's great to have you on the podcast today. I wanted to dive right into the discussion. You have these ongoing tensions between Canada and India. We've seen these tensions escalate recently, which has led to a halt in trade negotiations. It also seems to have stemmed from the murder of Sikh activist Hardeep Singh Nijjar in Canada, with us pointing fingers at the Indian government. And then you have this long-standing issue of Sikh separatism, and Canada's involvement has strained relations. Ultimately, it's resulted in India asking Canada to reduce its diplomats. It's a complex situation with implications not just for diplomacy, but possibly for our Indo-Pacific strategy. I'd like to start off by asking you, how does this incident between Canada and India reflect the complexities of the international security environment right now?
Well, I think that the complications in the international security environment are reflected in the fact that this is not just a Canada-India bilateral issue. This has much broader strategic implications. So I think first and foremost, it is between Canada and India. Very serious allegations have been made by the Prime Minister with respect to possible complicity of Indian authorities in the murder of a Canadian citizen, Mr. Nijjar. But because India is the big prize on the international stage these days, and what I mean by that is that everybody's courting them in the West, and that includes Canada's allies in the Five Eyes relationship and elsewhere, like the United States, like UK. Because of this courting, this complicates matters, and so there's an issue for the Canada-India relationship without a doubt, and where that relationship goes. But there's also an issue for the relationship between Canada and its allies, as I said, United States, UK, and then the relationship between the United States, UK, and others, and India. So it's almost like a three-dimensional chess game, if not more. It's quite complicated. Canada didn't have much choice, I don't think, at the end of the day, but to make public this allegation. India probably felt that it didn't have much choice but to respond in a fairly blunt way as to the allegations. The U.S. feels like it has to support its Canadian ally, but at the same time, it doesn't want to say too much that will upset the Indian government and call them out in a very public way that will possibly compromise American efforts to get the Indians on side with respect to being a bulwark against China and being a positive player for the West in the Indo-Pacific region. UK's in the same position, so there's been muted support publicly. There's probably a lot of support privately, but how far they can go publicly is another issue. So just that shows you how complicated it is right now, and I think that reflects the way it's playing out, which is a little bit difficult for all the parties involved. And I thought things were starting to quiet down a little bit, and we get these stories the last couple of days that the Indians are pushing to have more Canadian diplomats get out of India, and so the temperature is starting to rise again. So not good.
So you've hinted at quite a number of the stakeholders involved here, how they feel rather pigeonholed, especially with the most recent announcement from India with the call of asking for something like 41 diplomats to be out by the weekend. So I'm curious, how much leverage or recourse does Canada have following these allegations, considering India's actions since?
They don't have a lot of leverage, I don't think, at the end of the day. I think virtually all the commentators out there have been saying the same thing, that if there's a direct spat between Canada and India, Canada's probably going to lose. India's got all the economic leverage. Again, Canada's kind of in the courting domain. India as a potential bulwark against China, so much like the rest of the West, but also as a potential economic partner. Canada would desperately like a free trade deal. Canada would like to tap into that huge domestic Indian market of, well over 1 billion people, largest population in the world now, as we all know. So they're a little bit more of the demandeur, and I think India is kind of in a world of, well, this is annoying, and I think in many respects they find Canada is probably a little bit like China probably felt about Canada during the two Michaels and the Mung affairs, as a very, very, very annoying mosquito that won't go away. And so how dare you speak out and make these accusations against us, whether they're true or not. The Indians aren't going to admit to it. And they don't need the Canadian economy. They don't necessarily need Canada on side. And they don't hear the United States or the UK or others banging the drum publicly saying, India, you've got to do this or that. I mean, I think the Americans have been a little bit more forthright in the last week or so. Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor for the U.S., saying, come on, India, you've got to play ball here. You've got to work with the Canadians in terms of an investigation. But again, as I said earlier, the U.S. is not going to start screaming from the rooftops for India to be more cooperative at the end of the day. I think what everybody would like to see, in particular the United States and probably Canada as well, is this being sorted out through quiet diplomacy, not done in a public way, not measures that are aimed to humiliate, to really force one country or the other into a corner. That's not the way to do it. And unfortunately, what the Indians are now potentially doing with this latest measure is pushing Canada into a corner. And this is going to make it difficult to get out. And what recourse, what leverage does Canada have to do? I mean, they can call on the U.S. to be a little bit more outspoken, but as I said, I don't think that's going to happen. They can go back to the Indians and say, please don't do this, but I think they probably tried that already, and they've tried to have a quiet conversation. The Indians are not going there. So there's not a lot of leverage, and it'll be interesting to see what Canada does.
Is it possible that this muted response has emboldened India in any way?
Well, it's an interesting point because initially I would say no. I thought that the U.S. struck just the right note. I mean, they didn't say much at first. There was the usual, both the United States and the UK, and actually Australia too, the standard diplomatic language. We're deeply concerned about this turn of events, and we're deeply concerned about these allegations. And then everyone kind of went, well, that's not much. And then a few days later, Jake Sullivan came out and said, well, no, there's no exceptionalism here. Just because India is a big power and we're all courting it, if they did what they did, this is not good. This is really breaching the rules-based international order and extraterritorial killings. You can't do that sort of stuff. Notwithstanding what happened to Saudi Arabia and where the U.S. is with Saudi Arabia right now. So when they said that, I thought that then the Indians seemed to go quiet. And so I thought that was actually a good sign. So I was thinking, well, maybe there is some backroom diplomacy happening here and they're going to resolve this in a quiet way. But now the Indians have come out with this latest measure, allegedly, and I'm not sure what the motivation was for that. I don't know why this has popped up a week, 10 days after the last explosion, over visas or some of the rhetoric about Canada not being a safe place for Indians to visit and all kinds of threats and so on and so forth. So the rhetoric had dropped. Now it's back up again. Is that because the U.S. hasn't said anything further? I don't know. It's really, really hard to figure out. But I'm pretty sure the Indians know that they're in a strong position here. That they're not going to be called out in all likelihood, unless the intel is brought out in a very, very public way that there's a smoking gun and the Indians did it, and that's not going to be good for the Indians. But they'll weather it, right? Just like Saudi Arabia weathered it with Khashoggi, and they got through it, and they went from being a pariah state to potentially a very, very close defense partner now with the United States. So I think India is going to play the long game here.
The last time you joined us on the program was in the wake of the Johnson report on foreign interference, and you made a statement that the manner in which the intelligence had come about, that it had been leaked, undermines national security, as do the partisan politics that play out around that leaked intelligence. And I was wondering, how does the manner in which the intelligence regarding India's foreign interference being treated impact Canada's national security? And does it make a difference that it came from the Prime Minister in the House of Commons, given the speculation that it was going to be leaked anyway?
Well, sure. So the Prime Minister came out and made his statement in the House of Commons, and I think that the prevailing story now is that that statement probably wasn't going to be made when it was, except for the fact that the Globe and Mail had the story. And so Bob Fife from the Globe and Mail, I think, has even said this publicly, and I think it was in his first article that he called up PMO we've got this story. What do you think? And PMO came back and said, well, we're going to give you, we need a week. And Bob said, no, you can't have a week. And then so the prime minister felt he had no choice but to go out and make this statement, which I think was on a Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken. And he probably felt he had to, because the Globe had the story, but also the Chinese foreign interference fiasco was fresh in his mind. And I'm sure the thinking was, oh boy, if we have another headline in the Globe and Mail, leaked intel, then we're really in a bit of a bind here. And we're going to look bad again that we're behind the power curve and we're playing catch up and that we were trying to hide stuff from Canadians, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this is a little bit different than Chinese foreign interference in a lot of ways, in my view. And it's the kind of thing where you can try through quiet diplomacy to sort it out. Would it have to have come out eventually? Yes, in all likelihood, it would have had to have come out. The prime minister would have had to have said something. But I think that clearly they were already working with the Indians to try and sort this out. The National Security Intelligence Advisor had gone over to India. The director of CSIS had gone over to India. The prime minister had raised it with Modi. The president, apparently, President Biden had raised it with Modi as well. So they were trying to sort this out. So they didn't want it to come out when it did, but their hand was forced. What's interesting is that they said that we have intelligence, but they didn't actually say what the intelligence was. And so that has not come out. I mean, with the Chinese foreign interference, the intelligence there's a lot of detail. This is what we've got. They had names, they had everything. This time it's, we've got, what was it? Serious allegations, I think, potentially linking Indian authorities to this killing in Surrey. And that was it. They didn't tell us what, actual information they had or how they gained it. And then stories have come out since, I think in the CBC in particular and some in the US as well, saying that, well, there may be some signals intelligence. They may have intercepted some discussions between Indian diplomats. There may have been some human intelligence. There may have been some intelligence from within the Five Eyes, including from the U.S. and Ambassador Cohen, U.S. Ambassador to Canada, has said that there's an intel flowing around in Five Eyes, but including, I think he said that it was from the U.S. So you got a lot of the how, but you still don't have the what. Like, what exactly did you hear? Did you hear two Indian diplomats saying, we are going to kill this individual, or after the fact, we have killed this individual? How much of a smoking gun do you have, if one at all? I've said publicly on numerous occasions, and even when I was NSIA, I used to say this, it's very rare you have a smoking gun. Even in the Khashoggi case, you've got audio, you've got videos, et cetera, but it wasn't, it was probably about 99%, but it wasn't 100% certain. And here, nobody knows. So, it's going to be difficult to release it all because, going back to your original question, how does this impact our national security? If you start revealing the details of intelligence, you reveal tradecraft, you reveal intelligence methodology in terms of collection and collection methods, and and that undermines your national security. And then also you can potentially expose human sources, if indeed human sources were used in this case, and that's not good. You put their lives at risk because based on the intelligence that you put out publicly, other entities can figure out where that intel may have come from. Oh, we got a feeling it was Mr. X over here who had a conversation with Mr. Y. So you got to be really, really careful. So how much comes out in the end? I don't know. It's going to be difficult for the government, and I've said that. They're kind of between a rock and a hard place because they've teased the Canadian public. I don't know how much they've told the Indians. I mean, they've probably told them a lot, but they can't put the actual documents in front of them and the conversations in all likelihood. They probably describe the sources that they have, but it's difficult for them to sort of say, we're going to open the kimono and you're going to see it all here. I think that's going to be very difficult to do.
You mentioned the Five Eyes, and I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the significance of their role in the intelligence activities that led up to Canada's allegations against India in such a public forum.
So I don't know. There's been publicly suggestions that there was intel flowing amongst the Five Eyes allies. I would take that to mean most likely the United States and the UK. Could have been Australia, New Zealand, but unlikely. Most likely the US. I don't know what the nature of that intel is. Canada's also said that it shared some of the intel with Five Eyes. So information is going back and forth here. And I think if you were to get anything from a Five Eyes ally, it's most likely signals intelligence. But I don't know how much of it was the U.S. Did the U.S. come up with the key piece of intel? I don't know. It's impossible to say. And that's what I was saying before. We may never know, because that's not going to be something they're going to want to put out there publicly. So you end up speculating quite a lot, and I don't like speculating. But it does look like there was some information going back and forth between the Five Eyes. Well, I think this is, again, a little bit different than the Chinese foreign interference, where actual documents were being leaked and shown to the press, and considerable details when it came to the intel that was out there. As I said before, names and dates, and it was very, very specific. This is different in the sense that all you've got is that there's an allegation. We've got intel that would lead us to believe that the Indians are complicit, but they haven't shown, the government has not shown that intel. And my understanding is that the Canadians went to the U.S. ahead of time and said, we're going to have to go public with this, and that there was a degree of comfort. That's what I believe. And I'm hearing that, notwithstanding the Washington Post story and other U.S. news outlets, that the U.S. has not had Canada's back. The U.S. has been actually very, very supportive behind the scenes, extremely supportive behind the scenes as to this going forward. So I don't think there's going to be any blowback on this one with respect to, here the U.S., here's Canada again, leaking like a sieve. They haven't leaked like a sieve. The government made a conscious decision to go out there and say, we've got intel. We need to call India out. And I think the U.S. was supportive. I think the U.S. understood that Canada didn't really have a choice. You got to remember as well that, it's not like the U.S. has not had their fair share of leaks over the last little while. They've had some egg on their face. So, I know from my own experience in Five Eyes, when this sort of thing happens, when intel gets leaked, and again, this is not really part of that pattern, but going back to Chinese foreign interference or the Ortiz affair that we're hearing about right now with respect to the RCMP, Cameron Ortiz, there's a kind of general philosophy of there go I, but for the grace of God. So it's happening to you today, but that could be us. That could be us, New Zealand, UK, Australia, US the next day. So, there's always a fair bit of understanding and sympathy that this has happened. But then there's hard conversations about, okay, so what got leaked, and is there anything from our country that we need to be aware of? But I think in this case it's a little bit different. I don't think there'll be any repercussions.
How does Canada navigate its diplomatic relationships with countries like India, which may engage in interference tactics, or while also pursuing economic and political cooperation?
Well, it's a $64,000 question. It's a great question, and that's the conundrum, and that's where Canada finds itself right now, between a rock and a hard place. So I think that when a country, whether it's a hostile state actor towards Canada, like China or Russia, or a fellow democracy which you thought was reasonably friendly, when they carry out an extraterritorial, extrajudicial killing on your own soil, if you were one of your own citizens, it's difficult not to call them out. And whether you do it privately or you do it publicly, I don't think anybody can really criticize Canada for not saying to the Indians, you've been a bad boy here, you guys. So this is not right to do. But it's a question of how far do you go? What's the sweet spot? And as I said before, you've got a broader bilateral relationship with a country that's very, very important to the West right now. So how far do you want to go? How far do you want to take this? You're the smaller power. You're probably going to lose in the end in any diplomatic turf war. If it gets into serious sanctions and things like that, if India says they're not going to be sending students anymore to Canada, that would be a humongous blow. Just the foreign students issue is huge. So I'm sure that Canada is now in a world. I speculated before that the U.S. probably told both Delhi and Ottawa, please sort this out behind the scenes. I suspect that's where Ottawa would like to sort it out as well. Let's just engage in what I keep on calling quiet diplomacy, and let's try and get somewhere. But if India keeps on doing things like they did yesterday, you asked about leverage. They don't have much leverage. So on the one hand, as you say, human rights, your own national integrity, your territorial integrity, your sovereignty, the killing of one of your own citizens, you've got to speak out. But you've also got to try and preserve a bilateral relationship and continue to function in the world and work with your allies. But to a considerable extent, it will depend to what extent allies stand by Canada. And that's where I say I'm just not sure that you're going to see other countries start screaming from the rooftop, if I can use that phrase again. India, you're totally in the wrong here, and we're calling you out. I just don't know if Canada's going to get that level of support. So they're in a bind. They're truly in a bind.
What can be learned from these diplomatic tensions, and how can Western nations better address the concerns raised by countries regarding diaspora politics and extremism?
Well, that's another extremely good question, and that's a second $64,000 question, because in many respects, that's at the heart of this issue, right? This horrible incident, the actual killing of Mr. Najir, and then the possible Indian complicity. This did not come out of nowhere. I mean, there's a long history of a fraught relationship between India and Canada, dating back to the downing of Air India in the mid 1980s. And the relationship, I think, has kind of gone up and down since then, but it's been particularly bad under the Trudeau government, and everything from the 2018 visit to Prime Minister Trudeau calling out the Indians on the agrarian protests a couple of years ago and saying you've got to respect freedom of expression. The Indians have been basically of the view that Canada harbors terrorists. I mean, to put it bluntly, that's kind of what they're saying. They claim Mr. Najjar was a terrorist. They had him on a terrorist watch list, and they wanted to bring him back to Canada. Canada is turning around and saying, well, not every single one of these guys is necessarily a terrorist. We believe in freedom of expression. And if Sikh Canadians want to go out in the streets and express their support for an independent Sikh state, Khalistan in the Punjab, they're entitled to do that. Now, the threshold is if they're saying that publicly and then behind the scenes, they're plotting the assassination of Indian politicians or cabinet ministers, or they're funneling money to terrorist groups, that's a terrorist act, and that's different. This proclamation from the Indians, or this perception out there publicly that Canada has not done anything to counter violent Sikh extremism. I mean, that's wrong. I mean, I can tell you that that's wrong. You just look at the listing of a couple of Sikh entities as part of the criminal code. They've been listed as terrorist entities, and I still have to adhere to the Security of Information Act, but other stuff has been done, but it's not enough for India, and so that's the biggest issue, I think, is that whether they actually committed this act or not, they're clearly fed up with Canada not doing enough. So again, how do you balance that? How do you, on the one hand, say in a country like Canada, in our democracy, you're allowed to do this stuff, but then India saying, yeah, you're allowed to do that stuff, but this stuff is crossing that threshold, and we are telling you it's crossing that threshold. So how do you engage in that debate? How do you deal with it publicly? How do you have that conversation? And India is a democracy, but it's not necessarily the same kind of democracy that Canada is. And if you look at Indian democracy these days, and Prime Minister Modi and the way he's cracking down on Muslims and on other minority groups, and there's a very, very strong hint of Hindu nationalism in India right now, they have a hard time understanding why Canada's being so tolerant. So how do you get out of that conundrum? It's like two solitudes right now in terms of the dialogue. It's easy to say, well, they've got to have more dialogue and they've got to talk this through. I mean, that's the easiest thing in the world to say, but it's probably that's where it starts, right? It starts with a good conversation, and I think that Canada, and I know this has happened in the past, Canada's got to say, well, look, this is actually what we've done. And if we think as much as we can possibly do, but if India is still going to believe that that's not enough, you're still going to have an issue. I think allies helps again. I think especially the UK, which has a very large Sikh minority, if UK and Canada can stand together here and have a common position, that helps. But it's not going to be resolved overnight. It's a very difficult conversation. I don't think India is willing to compromise, and Canada is not going to compromise bedrock democratic principles of freedom of expression and peaceful protest. Now, if you get a case where you got clear evidence that someone's being a terrorist or is a terrorist and Canada's not done anything, well, that's a different conversation. But again, it's hard to have these discussions openly because you can't reveal all the intelligence, and sometimes you haven't necessarily laid criminal charges against somebody, but that doesn't mean you're not keeping your eye on them if you think they're a threat to Canadian security. So there's a lot of gray in there as well. But that's my point. It's not black and white. The perception out there right now amongst many that India's got it completely right is not right. But at the same time, the opposite is also not necessarily accurate, and that every single expression of Sikh declarations of Sikh expressions of interest in an independent state that it isn't potentially tied to some terrorist activity. It's not categorical.
Well, Mr. Rigby, thanks for joining us again. I think it's been a great and enlightening discussion, and we hope to have you on the podcast again in the future. That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks, and we hope you'll be joining us next week.